So at this point, it's really my pleasure to introduce to you the first speaker for today's symposium. And again, we are also happy that although her luggage didn't make it, she did make it, along with Frank. Angela Kerins is the Chief Executive Officer of the Rehab Group, a leading non-for-profit organization which operates in Ireland, the UK, Poland, and the Netherlands, delivering high-quality, person-centered services to people with disabilities, older people, and others who are marginalized. Last year, over 43,000 people accessed its range of health and social care, training and education, and rehabilitation, employment, and commercial services in more than 250 locations. Over 3,500 people are employed by the Rehab Group and its divisions. Between 1999 and 2009, Angela was the chairperson of the Irish National Disability Authority and was instrumental in establishing the National Disability Strategy. In partnership with the Ireland's Prime Minister's Office, Angela was appointed as co-chair of the National Disability Strategy Stakeholders Monitoring Group, a group established by the Irish government to ensure the effective implementation of the strategy. Angela has also advised other national governments on the development of their national disability strategies. In 2007, Angela was appointed by the Irish government as chairperson of the state's equality body, the Equality Authority. Angela is also a member of the Irish Health Information and Quality Authority, which is the regulatory body for the healthcare in Ireland, and she serves on the National Council of the Irish Business and Employers Confederation. And in 2003, Angela was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws by the National University of Ireland, University College Dublin, for her contribution to the disability community. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Angela Kerins. Angela.
Wanted to say this, so good morning, America. There's a little story behind me being here. My colleague Frank Flannery was the honoured guest, or is the honoured guest, should I say, to this conference. And I had a look at the agenda and I thought, God, that's very, very interesting, because I have a significant interest in advocacy. So I said to my office, look, I think I might go along there and see all the good work that they're doing. And the next thing was I got a message from Paul and from Vicky to say, oh no, you're not. If you're here, you're going to work. So consequently, that's why I'm standing here this morning. And it has been, Paul, a very eventful journey. We started out sometime, we got up about 5 o'clock yesterday morning to come from Dublin, and ended up waiting for a flight in Newark to Buffalo, which didn't arrive. And they bounced us over to LaGuardia. Our bags stayed in Newark, and we got here eventually sometime last night. But again, thanks to your colleagues that picked us up, because God knows where we would have been had they not done that. Because when we were given all the information for our bags to, I think it was United Airways, they were saying where they'd been delivered to, and I was going, and then she said, I know where that is, it's called Chautauqua. And I thought, I'll never think of that. And then I thought of Shania Twain, and I thought, don't mind her, she comes from here. So I suppose, Paul, going back to your preacher there, maybe the mistake we made was we didn't say, Lord help us. Last night. Okay, I'll just move along here. Do we point to it? Oh, yeah, I know. Okay, you've all done a lot of this already, but here we go, you go again. The Rehab Group is a not-for-profit organisation established in 1949. We have a lot of employment and commercial services in the health and social care area, and training and education and in rehabilitation. We, as I say, Paul has said, 3,500 people, of whom 14% of those are people with disabilities. We have around 50,000 beneficiaries every year, and we're in quite a number and growing number of locations. We're afraid to say UK, and we come from Ireland, because the Scots want us to say Scotland, and the Welsh, we're not in there. We've just gone into Wales there recently. Don't want to be in the UK either. They want to say Scotland, England, and Wales, so we do that. And we work to influence leaders and policymakers to deliver positive change in the lives of people, all of those people who access our services. And like all of you, we're constantly innovating. Let's see if this works now. Yeah, brilliant. So let's look at Ireland for a moment. In our 2006 census, we don't have an awful lot of people living there, but we do have 4.2 million living in Ireland, and 9.2% of those are people with disabilities. And also, people with disabilities, as I'm sure you're probably finding here, are 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed. Okay. Maybe you just we're talking about the disability policy and how we establish disability policy in Ireland. I think consultation and participation by people with disabilities and their representative organisations is vital. It's essential and can't be done otherwise. In looking at our policies in Ireland, we wanted to ensure that people with disabilities were not always in segregated settings, that they were in mainstream settings, and that's always a challenge when you're trying to provide some specialist services as well. But it was really, really important that somebody with a disability accessed the same services as all of the rest of us. We realised that you can't do this overnight, and there had to be some form of incremental progression in relation to a policy. And of course, interagency cooperation. That was a challenge, and I'll come back to that later, but that was a challenge. But it was very, very important that organisations of people with disabilities and the state agencies cooperated together. And of course, it was a time of growth in Ireland at that time. So the disability policy in Ireland, we had 2 decades really of progress. And that provided a good framework to ensure people with disabilities play their role in public life. In 1993, we had the Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities, and that was a huge consultation right across the country of people with disabilities, of service providers, of families, parents, siblings, obviously, and the different state bodies and the not-for-profit organisations. And that came up with quite a number of challenges and opportunities. But one of the most significant issues there, it demonstrated the fragmentation of services to people with disabilities and the multiplicity of organisations that were dealing with people with disabilities. So that really ensured for us that it highlighted the access issues and the confusion that people with disabilities and their families would be experiencing daily when they're trying to get services. In the late 90s then, there was a change of government, and in the late 90s, the new government coming in decided that it needed to implement the recommendations, and there were 304 recommendations of the Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities. So the mainstreaming issue in particular started, and what I mean by that is, at that time, there was an organisation called the National Rehabilitation Board, and everybody with a disability went to the National Rehabilitation Board for any vocational training, or indeed they did some audiology testing and a few other things in the National Rehabilitation Board, but primarily vocational rehabilitation. Where everybody else went to an organisation that we called FORCE, and this was unacceptable. Why not people with disabilities access the same vocational training gateways as everybody else? So the NRB was disestablished. Took us about 18 months to disestablish it because there was an awful lot of protocol involved in that. But the funding, the budgets went in different directions. Anything to do with health went into health, education went into education, and employment and training went into the Employment and Training Agency. wasn't without its difficulties, and it wasn't perfect when it was achieved either, but it was very much progress. At the same time in the 90s, as I suppose as a member of the European Union in particular, we brought in the equality legislation. And two pieces of legislation in particular, the employment equality legislation and the equal status legislation. Employment equality speaks for itself. The equal status was equality in access to goods and services. And you're looking at 9 grounds there, including disability, you're looking at age, you're looking at race, you're looking at religion, you're looking at gender, all across quite a number of grounds. We're all protected and discrimination outlawed across these grounds for everybody, including people with disabilities. That was important because the Equality Tribunal was also set up, and that had the right to hear and decide on cases of discrimination in Ireland. And then of course we had our little Celtic tiger was purring away there in the background, and it gave us the foundation to, I suppose, finance the possibility of a national disability strategy. So in the about 2006, the National Disability Strategy was established. Now that wasn't, again, it didn't start out as a strategy, it started out as a piece of legislation called the Disability Bill. And we found through, I led the sector in the negotiations with government on the Disability Bill, and we found that albeit a piece of legislation is very, very important, but also it needs to be underpinned by policy and funding and a monitoring body. So the whole thing brought together a strategy, and I'll be coming back to that in a moment. And then, bang, here comes our economic difficulties, which slowed the whole thing up. And move on to the next slide, please. So in relation to our equality legislation, as I've already said, the pieces of legislation you see in front of you there, the Employment Equality Acts and the Equal Status Acts. They're acts because there have been some amendments to them over the years. And those amendments were coming from EU directives. In fact, up until I'd say 2 years ago, Ireland led in its equality agenda, led in Europe. But since then, a number of most of the other countries have caught up in the implementation of the equality legislation. And you'll see there the discrimination on the 9 grounds. Again, moving on. The Disability Legislation Consultation Group. Well, this was a learning process for everybody. In 2001, the Disability Bill was published, but that bill, prior to its enaction, was not welcomed at all by the disability sector. It really let people down in relation to rights-based legislation and people's expectations. So the government pulled the bill and set up a consultation group. It's called the Disability Legislation Consultation Group. And that was made up of 8 umbrella bodies in disability coming together to try and establish the key principles that would be acceptable to the disability sector in that new Disability Act when it would come. So the Equal Citizens document was published in 2003, and that was an interesting time because it was also the European Year of People with Disabilities, and we also had the Special Olympics in Ireland that year. But the DLCG published the Equal Citizens, and that was the sector's consensus. And can I tell you, it was blood, sweat and tears consensus. We had a lot of growing up and understanding of each other and understanding of what could be done in legislation for citizens with disabilities. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly moved the agenda much further. And that Disability Legislation Group represented, now remember we're a very small country, it represented 507 disability groups, disability organisations, and hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities. So we eventually came to an agreement as the content of it, and that was great because then we had a common document and we could move forward on the negotiations with government. So moving down to the next slide, if I may, we moved on, as I said then, to the National Disability Strategy, published in 2004, and as the slide says, it underpins the participation of people with disabilities in society. Many people think that it's a health issue, or it's kind of an education issue, and maybe some people outside in the big world might think